For those of you that are joining online, we are live, but we are not getting started for another couple of minutes.
All right, this meeting is called to order at 9:06 a.m. As a reminder, all members attending virtually please unmute and turn their cameras on for any voting that takes place. And I think Director Ross, will you take the roll?
Vice Chair, Chair Clark, thank you. Yes. Member Buttles.
Present.
Member Kanto.
Present.
Chair Clark?
Present.
Oh, a good reminder. So folks, the microphone system, we record the meetings and it picks up the sound better. So when you're speaking, hit the button, it'll go green. And then as soon as you're done speaking, hit it and it'll go red. So Dr. Durden.
Present.
Member Haley.
Present.
Vice Chair Meyerson.
Present.
Member Overton.
Present.
Member Palmer is not with us today. Member Sanchez.
Present.
Member Shepard.
Present.
And Member Vaughn.
Present.
Chair Clark, you have a quorum.
No red, no green. Thank you. All right. Welcome to the second K-3 Early Literacy Subcommittee meeting. This presentation will provide the subcommittee with national data and key definitions related to chronic absenteeism and its impact on student learning. With us today to present is Cecilia Long, the Vice President of Programming from Attendance Works.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. Thank you for putting my slides up, Terry. Today, we're going to take a look at state strategies to reduce chronic absenteeism. Next slide. As we all know, chronic absence is missing 10% of the school year for any reason. This is how it's defined nationally and also in Arizona. So it includes excused, unexcused, and days missed due to suspensions. Next slide. We know there's a real difference between average daily attendance, truancy, and chronic absence. And happily, we are moving towards chronic absence, where we look at the impact of all absences on student learning. And I really appreciate that we are taking a much more preventative, problem-solving approach in partnership with families to improve student attendance and get students back to school. Next slide. So the research is quite clear about the impact of chronic absence upon student learning. Please click through the slide for me. When students are missing 10% or more beginning in the earliest grades, we see the impact on third grade reading proficiency, which is a major policy goal in Arizona. And after that, if chronic absence continues, we see lower achievement through middle school as measured by NAEP scores and the greater likelihood of students dropping out in high school. Next. We've been sounding the alarm that we have a national chronic absence crisis. We've seen the near doubling of chronic absence rates pre-pandemic to 21-22. That's 8 million students to 14.6. And when we look at state data in 22-23, the national estimate from AEI is that we're still at 26%. So we're not coming down very quickly. And when we look at Arizona's chronic absence rate for 22-23, it's similarly very high at 48%. Next slide.
Cecilia, this is Sean. I'm just going to pause for a moment, let the members of the committee know. So every presentation delivered today is in the materials in the agenda for the meeting, but we will also send them out to you via email after. So if you're frantically taking notes or any of that, we've got you, and those are coming your way.
Thank you. There is a lot of information on the slides, but hopefully I'm really making the point quickly that we have a serious issue that affects the well-being of our students, and that action is necessary in the short and longer term. So when we think about reducing chronic absence, we really need to understand what is happening and what is driving the numbers. Typically, we look at 4 buckets of reasons for absence. There are barriers like poor transportation or illness, aversion, things that make students avoid school, such as an unwelcoming school climate, and disengagement, whether students are feeling the lack of relevance, or struggling with the meaning of what they're learning. And the 4th, misconceptions. And we have new ones about why attendance is or is not important. But still, we see students and families are struggling with the idea that missing just 2 days a month is or isn't important. So we need to understand the reasons for absence in order to craft the right strategies in response. Next. So I'm going to share a bit from our policy brief, which it's embargoed. This is a sneak peek, and the numbers are not final. But we really wanted to look across the nation at states and what their attendance policies were. Next slide. And we asked 4 questions. We wanted to know, are states using timely data to publicize how many and which students are affected by chronic absence? We wanted to know if states are providing comparable data, and how do state policies differ with respect to key factors influencing the collection and use of chronic absence data? And finally, how are states promoting effective approaches to improving attendance? So I'll go quickly through this so that we can get to some of the state examples at the end. Next. So first, are states using timely data to publicize how many and which students, schools, and districts are affected by chronic absence? Next, the findings are good. More states are publishing chronic absence data earlier in the school year. So we see 22 states publishing by November, 11 more and DC by January 24, and 9 more by the end of March. And in 2 states, Rhode Island and Connecticut, there's real-time public information available. Second, next slide. We really are seeing much more disaggregated data, which gives educators and leaders more of an opportunity to intervene in the right ways. So the growth area is looking at district, school, and student populations and by grade. And this is essential for earlier intervention. And the good news in Arizona is thanks to Maplet, you can actually see grade level data. Next. So the second question is, are states providing comparable data? Next slide. And what we see is that the vast majority of states, including Arizona, continue to use a common definition of chronic absence as missing 10% of school for any reason. And most, but not all states include all absences when calculating chronic absence, which is important because we're measuring missed opportunity to learn. Next slide. So states are continuing to use widely varying definitions of a day of attendance, which makes comparing apples to apples a little more problematic. And this is a point of discussion, I believe, that the task force that Read on Arizona has led has brought up as well. So states also have widely varying enrollment policies and practices which affect the chronic absence numbers. And so you see the wide range of who's counted, ranging from students who are enrolled from 1 day in several states to 10 days or more, all the way up to 135. So there's a huge range, and there's not a lot around disenrollment. And only a few states, 3 of them, require outreach before disenrollment. And so this raises a set of policy questions for state boards of education. Next slide. So the third question we asked is how state policies differ with respect to key factors influencing the collection and use of chronic absence data. Next slide. So as an accountability measure, 36 states plus Washington, D.C. continue to use chronic absence as an accountability measure for school improvement. Next slide. And how they are counting students varies. So the majority of states primarily fund based upon average daily membership or student count. Arizona does this. But the 2 largest states and several others fund based on average daily attendance. Next slide. So how are states promoting effective approaches to improving attendance? There are several key strategies. One, we see states offering comprehensive, easy-to-use guidance to schools and districts. We see states organizing state attendance campaigns, emphasizing the importance and value of attendance. We see states encouraging districts to work across departments to leverage existing initiatives. So rather than having things operating in silos, braiding pieces together. And then shifting away from what doesn't work, including suspending students for absences. And finally, monitoring excused versus unexcused absences. Next. So I've been asked to say a few words about how other states are supporting districts and schools to improve attendance. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly and hopefully allow some time for questions afterwards. So starting with Connecticut. Next slide. We really are looking at states offering a range of supports to schools and districts, beginning with state support for all schools and districts. In the middle, support for districts with high levels of chronic absence, for example, communities of practice for districts or schools. And then for the lowest performing schools or districts, intensive technical assistance and coaching. So let me talk about Connecticut on the next slide. So even though this is a state that's relatively better off in terms of students experiencing poverty, there's a fairly significant number of districts and schools with high levels of chronic absence. So next, here are some of their approaches. It's a very data-driven approach. This is one of the states that provides monthly chronic absence data to districts and schools, so they know whether they're making progress. They have a statewide attendance campaign, and over the years that we've observed Connecticut, they definitely have provided communities of support for districts that have reduced chronic absence levels significantly. They issued policy guidance early in the 2010s, and there's a significant level of cross-agency collaboration. So with their public health department, for example, offering guidance on when children should stay in school while exhibiting symptoms of illness or to stay at home. And they have state-level teams and creatively blend funding sources and using their title dollars and also their IDEA money and ARPA funds to fund different initiatives. Next slide. So part of what they have done is create this public messaging campaign, and beginning with an understanding of why families were keeping students at home or what was keeping them from attending school. And the answers range from mental health and anxiety to concerns about safety at the school building or family obligations. Next slide. And switching over to New Mexico, they've taken a different approach. They've passed legislation, the Attendance for Success Act, which has shifted attendance policy and practice away from truancy and towards chronic absenteeism. New Mexico also offers publicly available data that both tracks the chronic absence levels and disaggregation, and also offers a percentage of which districts and schools have attendance improvement plans. With collaboration with their United Way, they offer a statewide attendance conference twice a year to support good practice, and they're working with Graduation Alliance and community schools. Okay, so that's New Mexico. Next. And finally, with Virginia, Virginia is taking a tiered approach with state support for all school districts. They have online courses through Canvas, website, learning modules, and conferences. At the middle level, they're providing districts with high levels of chronic absence with different tools, including a diagnostic tool that is tied to their school improvement plan. And finally, for their lowest performing schools, they have a collaborative learning cohort. And I'll say a couple of more words about that. Next slide. So for those schools, they've offered webinars, and they've also really encouraged the use of attendance plans based on data and looking at root causes. And they're offering technical assistance through regional meetings. And they're partnering across offices within the Department of Education to provide support. Next slide. So their year-long learning cohort for these particular schools began with some training from Attendance Works for their school teams, but were followed with cross-collaboration work between districts and in-person sessions that were hosted by the Virginia Department of Ed. Next slide. So that's it in terms of the walkthrough. I apologize for going so quickly, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions. And we can certainly pull back any slides or refer to your packets if you wish.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'm going to open it up to the committee members for questions. Member Haley.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I just had a couple questions related to the exemplar states or those that you featured. When you host webinars or when those states are hosting webinars, convenings, meetings to improve attendance, one, what is covered during that? And two, what is the impact on those schools or school districts? I know that school leaders, teachers are very, very busy. And so one more video to watch or webinar to participate in, I'm wondering how effective and impactful are those types of gatherings, either virtual or in person?
Great question. So I'm not able to summarize every single webinar they ever did, but let me give you two examples. With Connecticut, when they did their communities of practice, they focused on their districts with higher levels of chronic absenteeism. And they worked over the course of a year. It was quite intensive and with invitation from their commissioner. All of the districts reduced chronic absenteeism. This was pre-pandemic. With Virginia, what they did, they targeted their what they call their level 3 teams, basically the schools with the highest levels, and they made it voluntary. They paid for all the training and technical assistance, and they made it voluntary for school teams to participate. And they offered recordings afterwards. I don't think you can create a correlation between that piece and the results, but their chronic absence rates have come down, as have Connecticut's. So hopefully that is helpful to you. And I do think that the recordings help a great deal with reviewing material and helping those who could not attend in real time or, as happens so often, got interrupted because of other things happening in the school building.
Thank you so much for those two anecdotes. I guess the question is in those gatherings, or is it, are the teachers, the school leaders, the system leaders, are they learning about how to engage their teachers and students and parents? Is that sort of what is being taught in order to be able to, or is it like providing best practices on reducing barriers or providing best practices on how to engage the mental health and well-being? Is it topics like how to create a safe space so that students, when they do arrive, they feel like it's conducive to learning? I guess I'm just kind of, help me understand.
Yes, you want to get more of a flavor of how they
get
go
a
about
better
this.
understanding of like why that seems to be working, or at least is, maybe it's only causal, but I'm just trying to understand.
Absolutely. So I can offer some of the content, and I would invite others who have done this work also to comment as well. Terry Clark, I know, knows quite a bit about this. We look at data. So first is knowing who is chronically absent, which groups, which grades, which schools, so that you know where to focus. Second, a lot of what is covered is how to create an effective team. It can be an existing one, or it could be a standalone team, but the team organizes what happens in the school. And a lot of the content focuses on the prevention and early intervention using that chronic absence data. The next piece that's so critical is understanding the why and realizing that so many factors affect why students attend or don't attend school. And we focus very much on the factors that are within the locus of control of schools. Most of the trainings I've seen focus on building leaders, sometimes district leaders, and it equips them to work with their faculty who really can't be excused during the school day to participate in a school-wide piece. but engaging families positively, proactively, and in a problem-solving fashion really makes a difference. So that's some of the content. I'm hoping that gives you more of a flavor of what you're looking for.
Yes, thank you.
Chair.
Oh,
So, Chair Clark, sorry, something Cecilia said, I just wanted to really quickly because I know it's something that's come up a bunch in meetings, talking about the determining who is chronically absent. So not necessarily now if there are other questions, but I maybe just addressing the difference between average daily attendance and chronic absenteeism and how to disentangle might just be a good foundational point.
you want Cecilia to do?
Just, yeah,
Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Cecilia, and then we'll go to
Yes,
Dr.
I wasn't sure if that was addressed to you or to me. So average daily attendance is a wonderful school-wide measure. It measures on average how many students show up every day for school. And it's really important when you're allocating resources or planning for staffing, et cetera. But it doesn't tell you who is chronically absent. So you can have 5 different schools with 95% average daily attendance. And that sounds great, right? But if you take those numbers apart and you look at chronic absence rates in each of those schools, they can range all the way up to 16, 17%. I've seen that happen. And so you don't know which students are at risk and missing that level because the same kids aren't absent every single day.
Thank you. That was so much better than I could have done, Cecilia. So thank you. Dr. Durden, your question.
Good morning, and thank you for your presentation. I wanted to go back to that slide where you had the barriers, aversions, disengagement, and misconceptions.
Correct.
So I was a principal in Maryvale, and we had particular students who were consistently chronically absent, and we knew it wasn't of any fault of theirs. We would go to the home and then found out there were issues in the home. I guess we would say, I don't want to divulge them. What have you found in the states who are having success? How are they engaging these families who may need social supports, transportation, medical attention for themselves? A lot of grandparents are raising their grandchildren, and they don't have the capacity to sometimes get the kids to school daily. Those are the ones that really hurt because I knew the kids needed to be there, but because their caregiver wasn't in capacity to do so. What have you found just from any of your research on those kiddos?
Absolutely. And I appreciate your real life experience. Thank you so much for that question. I would point you to Connecticut and their LEAP home visit program. This was something they started as a tier 2 intervention, early intervention for chronic absenteeism. It's not on the slides right now. And what happened was they realized that it's really effective. The most trusted people in a family's lives are the teacher and sometimes the school nurse. And what happens is during COVID, Connecticut realized they had 120,000 students chronically absent, huge surge in numbers, and they needed people to reach out. So they used part of their ARP funding to put up the LEAP home visit program, positive, relational, supportive. And they rallied community-based organizations to help their school staff because the schools, while they could do a lot at that point, if you can recall, everyone was out sick, everyone was short-staffed. And so they used their community-based organizations to do that outreach, offer support, be positive, bring resources such as summer programming, connections to the internet back when they were doing online learning. So they came as helpful people to understand what was happening, develop relationship, and offer support. So that was a great piece, and the research and evaluation of the program shows clear impact on attendance, particularly in secondary, which was an amazing result to see.
Thank you.
There any other questions for our speaker? Go ahead.
I have one. Yes. On that same screen, did a particular area come to the top as reasons for chronic absenteeism between various aversions, disengagement, and misconceptions?
That's such a wonderful question. I wish we had the national study to show you the relative ranking. We have a few examples so far that really show mental health issues are rising to the top. So we have a survey of youth, for example, and 50% of them reported mental health issues, whether it was depression or anxiety, as key reasons why they were not engaging in school. We've also noticed, and there's no quantification of this, but we've seen it enough to know that it's widespread, that when families came back, if you recall, the public health guidance just kept shifting throughout the pandemic. And families just didn't understand when to send their child to school and when not to. You have a little cough, you have a sniffle, what should we do? And most parents, when there wasn't clear guidance, erred on the side of caution, because who wants to be the person who sends their child to school and makes everyone else sick, or, their child sicker? So a lot of the reasons that are easier to nip in the bud could be done through clearer guidance about when to go to school and when not to. So that's why we worked, for example, with the National Association of School Nurses and Kaiser Permanente to create some guidance around how to stay healthy and when to call a doctor and when to stay at home and when to go to school. So that was super helpful, but I think a lot of schools and districts still struggle with this. And that's an area, I think, where we could definitely make some progress in reducing absences.
Thank you.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Myerson, members of the committee. While this is not a report directly related to chronic absenteeism, in its February meeting, the board did have a presentation by the Arizona Department of Health on the school health needs assessment, that biannual assessment done by the Department of Health that hits on a lot of the sort of social emotional barriers that are on this slide. In addition to the materials we'll send you after the meeting, we'll include a link to that report as well.
Thank you, Director Ross. Anne?
Yes, I'm just curious if there have been any states that have had a targeted approach that has started with, say, pre-K and kindergarten in particular, in terms of putting kids on a trajectory for better attendance. Have you seen a state that has taken that approach?
Sorry, I was struggling with my microphone. Thank you for the question. There are several states, I cannot name them offhand, but for the Sturdy Bridge Initiative, it's the transition to kindergarten. Many states are considering that work. I would turn to Chair Clark actually to have her talk about what Arizona has done for years in concentrating in early chronic absenteeism. That is certainly an area where I think focusing our efforts and getting things right from the beginning would really pay off a great deal. So thank you for that question, and I would let Chair Clark respond more.
Chair Clark is going to let her colleague, when she presents, speak a little bit more about that. But it is a great question that I did not ask Anne to ask. But early is always a good place to start.
Just Chair Clark, Vice Chair Myerson, members of the committee, just to follow up on Anne's question, is there data that shows that chronic absenteeism at an early age is an indicator of that student having an issue, a struggle with that at later grades?
It absolutely is clear in the research that early chronic absence has an impact on a young child's ability to read proficiently at third grade. It has an impact on math. It has an impact on social emotional well-being. and more recent research showing it has effects on executive function over the course of time. So while it may not look terrible in the short term, the harm is real. So yes, the research is there, and we would be happy to send you the research reports afterwards if you would like. And coupled with that, if I may have 30 more seconds, when you look at where the chronic absence rates are highest by grade, it is highest in kindergarten. And if you have pre-K data, it's usually higher even than kindergarten. So just so you feel better about your state, I will talk about my home state of California, where we have kindergarten chronic absence hitting a high of 40%. And it improved to 36. So that is a huge impact when you think about statewide. If we don't intervene, what will happen to these children? So that's an argument for early intervention.
Thank you. Oh, one more question. We'll allow one more question, Dr. Durden.
You mentioned kindergarten in California. Is that half day kinder? Because I was a kindergarten teacher also, and a lot of parents like, it's half a day. I'm just going to let them stay at home.
It varies. It varies. So some districts are half day, some are full day.
I wonder if the data would show that those in half day have more. Because when I was a half day kinder, half the kids didn't come most of the time, especially on an early release day. It's like, why do I even come for an hour?
Exactly.
Why even for an hour? How do I get home? Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great research question to ask to see the difference.
Well, thank you, Cecilia. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, members, for great questions. And we are going to move on to the next item on our agenda. We thank you again. Attendance Works has been a wonderful national partner for Arizona.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And Chair Clark, sorry, Vice Chair Myerson, members of the subcommittee, just we also did include a link to Attendance Works in the agenda. So if you would like to learn more, follow up, the link to that site is there.
Thank you, Director Russ. All right, now that we have learned sort of the national landscape for chronic absenteeism, our next presentation from Lori Masur is to provide the subcommittee with Arizona-specific data and resources, including information related to the Arizona chronic absenteeism data, a collaborative data tool called Maplet, and then Arizona's chronic absenteeism task force and some of the great work over the last year that they have been working on. Welcome, Lori.
Welcome and thank you for having me. And when I go through the data, although I do not have a slide on early childhood, Anne, I will take an opportunity to provide you guys with a snapshot into what chronic absence looks like in the preschool space, and to also talk just a tad bit about a Chicago study that talked about the corollary connection between chronic absence rates in early childhood and then comparing those into the early grades. So next slide, please. So I've been asked to talk about really three buckets that Terry teed up nicely for, really giving you guys an idea of what I call the scope of Arizona's attendance challenge. So really digging into some of that data, covering four key pieces of legislation that touch on attendance, and then talking about our statewide approach to addressing Arizona's attendance challenge through the Chronic Absence Task Force. Next slide, please. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into the data that is very Arizona specific and really digging into that student level data. I love the fact that Cecilia teed up everything very nicely from that national landscape so we can talk about what's happening in the state of Arizona, and really thinking about Arizona did follow trends similar to the nation. Prior to the pandemic in 2018, we were doing rather well in terms of the chronic absence space, with just 12% of our students being chronically absent. And when we think about that 12%, we think that's in fact 1 in 8 students. So prior to the pandemic, 1 in 8 students were considered to be chronically absent. And for our populations that were economically disadvantaged, it was higher, but the gap was not that great. And then as we entered into the pandemic and coming out, it was no surprise to us that we were going to see an uptick in the levels of chronic absence. Cecilia touched on that just a little bit. Parents were concerned. When do I take my child back to school? What does the guidance say? I think what was a little surprising was as we edged into 2022, some people thought our chronic absence rates would begin to level back out. And in fact, they continued to move up. So much, in fact, that between 2018 and 2022, we saw a 20% increase in our chronic absence rates. And so we moved from 1 in 8 students being chronically absent to 1 in 3 students being chronically absent in the state of Arizona. And in addition to that, as you guys can see, for economically disadvantaged students, that rate hit almost 40%, and that gap began to widen. And so what we know is, with most other things, that our children who are our most vulnerable populations were more significantly impacted by the effects of chronic absence. And although we've seen that come down just a little bit in 2023, we are still sitting at just under 1 in 3 of our students being chronically absent. Now, sidebar off of this slide, and to address Anne's point, we have been looking very closely at chronic absence in the early childhood space. As a matter of fact, Attendance Works in 2016 provided some very targeted technical assistance to the Office of Head Start as it relates to their performance standards. And in the performance standards, they include provisions for addressing attendance in the early learning space. We do have that data. As of 2 years ago, that data became public. Just to provide a little bit of context, the Arizona Department of Education Early Childhood Division also serves as our state's Head Start State Collaboration Office.
Lori, will you just very quickly explain what Head Start is in case someone's not familiar?
Absolutely. So Head Start came to fruition actually 59 years ago. So we just celebrated Head Start's birthday. So they came into fruition 59 years ago underneath President Lyndon B. Johnson as part of his war on poverty. And so it provides high quality preschool services along with comprehensive wraparound support services to families who are most in need. Families most in need we define as living at 130% or below of the federal poverty rate. So just to provide a little bit of context. So when we look at data in the Head Start space, and I'm going to ask everybody to hold on to their seats for just a second. In the Head Start space, the most recent data shows that 74% of preschoolers in Head Start in the state of Arizona are considered to be chronically absent. Okay. Of that 74%, around 70% end up staying enrolled from beginning to end of a Head Start session, which typically follows a school calendar year. Member Haley, I saw that you had your hand up for a question.
So there's variability in Head Start programs. Some are half day, some are full day, some don't meet all 5 days. So what are our programs here in Arizona?
So our programs in Arizona also vary. So we have full day programs and half day programs. However, underneath Head Start performance standards, there's a threshold of children attending for 85%. So what happens is within the first 45 days of a child attending Head Start, alarms begin to sound. So when children begin to miss 2 or more days, whether that's a half day program or a full day program, Head Starts have the benefit of having the equivalent of what I would call an enrollment specialist known as an ERC director. And that ERC director is charged with reaching out to families within an hour of a child not showing up to school to say, hey, where's your kiddo? Are they going to be attending today? How can we help provide supports and services? Even with those in place, we notice in the Head Start space, because they are exhibiting a number of those barriers and aversions and misconceptions that you saw Cecilia put on the slide, we are still seeing in the state of Arizona our chronic absence rates hovering around 74%. And I'm going to tell you that that is in line with nationally with national Head Starts and educators throughout the nation. Okay. Why that's so important, and I know, Anne, this was one of your questions, is there was a study done out of Chicago, I believe 2017, 2018, that indicated the correlation between chronic absence rates in preschool and in the primary grades. A child who is chronically absent in preschool is 5 times more than likely to be chronically absent in second grade. We talk about kindergarten. Our data in kindergarten does mimic that of the nation. Every state in the nation in Washington, D.C. has compulsory attendance laws. So I just want to sort of do a little bit of level setting that compulsory attendance for first grade is not unique to Arizona. Every state has compulsory attendance laws. And with that chronic absence data, what we see is what we call a bowl effect. We see it very high in kindergarten. It tends to go down right around third grade. And then by the time they get into middle school, we see that curve back up again prior to them transitioning in to high school. So that just provides a little bit of the data where we are compared to the nation. And to address your point about chronic absence in the early learning space, Arizona is part of the K-3 Bridge initiative that's currently taking place, where we're looking at how do we strengthen what's happening in that kindergarten experience, but also how do we strengthen what's happening in the birth to 5 space into kindergarten and 3rd grade to ensure that continuity of services and supports. And so chronic absence is very much on our radar underneath that K-3 bridge. So next slide, please. I'm going to move us from thinking about it in terms of a student level perspective, in terms of a school level perspective. If you look to the left of the slide, you're going to see those different percentages. Those percentages refer to the percent of the student body that is considered to be chronically absent. For right now, I just want us to focus on the red, which is when a school has 30% of their 30% or more of their children who are chronically absent. We consider that to be extreme chronic absence. In 2019, 5% of schools in Arizona were experiencing extreme chronic absence. Okay. In 2021, that percentage quintupled to 25% of our schools experiencing extreme chronic absence. And then in 2022, we see that almost 60% of our schools are experiencing extreme chronic absence. So more than 30% of their student body is chronically absent. On any given day, a third of their student population is not present. And so to Cecilia's point earlier, this is where this sense of urgency comes into play. We knew the impact of attendance on academic performances and success prior to the pandemic. And looking at these numbers really sounds the alarm bells for really that sense of urgency as we move forward. So next slide. So, absolutely. Do you want us to go back? Okay. Okay.
Schools, public and charter schools, who is that demographic?
This is public and charter schools. Absolutely. So one of the resources that Cecilia mentioned was our ability to look at chronic absence data, not only at the school district level, but from the Maplet tool, we have the ability to see it from that state level, county level, school district, down to that school level. And the beauty of the Maplet tool, as it relates to the chronic absence data, is it allows us to dig even deeper. It allows us to see that trend over time. It allows us to see that data trend over time by grade level, kindergarten through 8th grade. And it also allows us to see that data trend over time by subgroup. All those schools and school districts have access to their own attendance data. The Maplet tool allows them to see where are they in comparison to the state, but also they're able to look at neighboring school districts or schools as well. So if you have an opportunity, if you haven't seen it yet, if you haven't explored it yet, it is a tool and a resource that is available for many.
And Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the committee, if the committee so chooses, time allows, we can absolutely go to Maplet and do a little walkthrough if that is something the committee desires later in the meeting.
Okay, so now we're going to move into, we've sort of set the stage with what's the state of chronic absence and attendance here in the state. I want to take a moment to cover 4 pieces of legislation that touch on attendance here in Arizona. And so the first piece I'm going to touch on is the guardian responsibility. As I mentioned, Arizona has compulsory attendance laws that apply to ages 6 to 16. Underneath 15802, it states that a guardian is responsible for ensuring that a child gets to school regularly on a full-time basis. And there are a couple exemptions to that. So for example, if a child is suspended and expelled, it kind of takes that responsibility away from a parent for ensuring that they get there. In addition, if a child is ill or there's a doctor's note, any reason that's deemed acceptable by the school, that serves as an exemption. One of the pieces that Cecilia touched on is the difference between average daily attendance, chronic absence, and truancy. Arizona does have truancy laws that are in place, and those truancy laws apply only to unexcused absences. And so when we're thinking about those unexcused absences, if those become excessive, meaning that you have 10% or more unexcused absences, the state can then deem that that child is considered to be incorrigible. At that point in time, a school district or school may choose to deploy legal measures against a family or punitive measures against a family. So just to let you guys know that those are two pieces in place. Next slide, please. What I really want to touch in on this part is, as Cecilia mentioned, that states have varying definitions that apply to daily attendance. And I'm going to touch on the daily attendance piece before I touch on the average daily membership piece. And so Cecilia mentioned that Arizona leaves the definition of attendance up to local discretion. So under 15901, we actually do have a definition of daily attendance. Actually, we have multiple definitions of daily attendance. It actually varies depending on what grade that you're looking at. So there's a different definition for kindergarten, 1st through 8th grade, and through high school. Even though we have those nuanced differences in the definition, for the most part, those definitions state that a child is considered to be present if they are attending for 3/4 of the instructional time model that a school district has designed. This is where it gets a little tricky and where the local discretion comes into play. Because underneath the instructional time model, we are impacted by setting and instruction type. So under setting, we're able to say that it can be any combination of in-person or remote instruction. And remote instruction can be up to 40% of the instructional time model or the instructional time day. In addition to that, there are 4 different instructional types that may be used, or any combination of those 4 instructional types. And those 4 instructional types are direct instruction, mastery of learning, project-based learning, and independent learning. And it's those 2 pieces that come together that account for that local discretion piece that Attendance Works was referencing. In addition to that, currently, student mobility is not addressed in the legislation or within those definitions. So before I move on to the next slide, I'll touch just a little bit on average daily membership. Arizona, to Cecilia's point, is a state that bases school funding on average daily membership. So looking at a student's membership within that first 100 days. And for the most part, chronic absence and attendance does not impact average daily membership or school funding.
Lori, before you move on, can you just, on the student mobility, kind of give the group a description of what that means of it not being currently addressed? Thank you.
Absolutely, no problem. So what we mean by student mobility not being addressed is we know here in Arizona that our students are highly transient, meaning that they can move from school district to school district all throughout the state. And currently right now, in terms of chronic absence, when we think about chronic absence being, missing 10% or more of any given school year, what happens is if I have Terry as my student and she starts out in Cartwright, and let's say Terry misses 10 days in Cartwright, and then she transfers on down the street to Roosevelt, those 10 absences don't follow Terry. Terry can pick up another 10 absences in Roosevelt, and she would not be considered chronically absent in Roosevelt. However, with totality of that, Terry's missed 20 days of school and in theory really is chronically absent. And so she's like, I've never been chronically absent. And so with that, we sort of have this missed opportunity to think about what supports and resources we might deploy for Terry or her family, because from both individual school districts' perspectives, she's not chronically absent. She's not pinging on their radar. And so right now, we're not accounting for that student mobility when they travel around the state from school district to school district.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Any other questions before I move on? So let me move on
I was just
to,
going to say, I was just going to interject
Yes.
because mobility isn't just about district to district. It's also about school to school within the
Yes.
same district, and wondering where have you been for the last 30 days that you didn't get over to your neighboring school, which is only 4 blocks away in our district.
and I think also another piece, not that we need to go down the rabbit holes and we think about children who are leaving, crossing over into other states when they live nearby, whether that's Utah, New Mexico, or California, and then coming back over. But I think that's a different ball of wax, but falls into that student mobility piece.
Yet our
as well.
Salinas kids and our Salinas from Salinas to Yuma, they do much better than our own kids within our own city. We get our migrant kids much faster. than we do our own kids.
All right, so I'm going to shift into the work that's been happening for a little over a year now here in the state, thinking about how we are addressing chronic absence. And I just want to take a moment before we dive into this piece to acknowledge our partners at Helios. Helios did some research in the chronic absence space, looking at 2 cohorts of students and looking at K-8 chronic absence trends between 2017 and 2021. And the research that they did really began to serve as the impetus to the work that we've been doing in the Chronic Absence Task Force, and really has served as some strong foundation of data points and research pieces that have informed the work of the Chronic Absence Task Force. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge their research and their work that very much aligns with what we're seeing at a national level, but is very Arizona specific and has very much been informing the work of the task force. So when we think about attendance and its impact on academic success, this is where it really falls into our shared strategic priority of how do we scale and sustain evidence-based literacy strategies that we know work. And Cecilia touched on this a little bit about those effective approaches that we know work. For us, we know that the data is clear. And I'm not sure if this was a piece that was sent in the packet or not, but I know that a number of years ago, Read on Arizona worked with Arizona State University to do a study about the factors that were impacting early literacy. And one of those factors was attendance. And a result of that work showed, that at a 1% increase in attendance at the school level resulted in a 1.5% increase in reading proficiency levels on the statewide ELA assessment. And so for us, we see that corollary data and connection between regular attendance and improved literacy outcomes here in the state of Arizona. And so it very much aligns into those shared strategic priorities for us, in particular when it comes to thinking about those evidence-based proven strategies that we know work. Next slide, please. So as I stated, the Chronic Absence Task Force began convening just a little bit over a year ago. And that was when we had our first meeting. To give you an idea of who's part of that state task force, we do have state agency partners that includes, the governor's office, the State Board of Education. We do have a number of school districts who serve on that to provide that perspective. What's happening north of I-40 in the state of Arizona? What's happening in, Maricopa County? What's happening in the southeastern part of our state? In addition to some of our community partners, all with the presumption that we need to have an idea of what's happening at a national level. That national policy scan that Cecilia provided to you guys, Attendance Works has been working very closely in providing some targeted TA to the Chronic Absence Task Force. And so we've had the ability to dig into national policy as well as our own local policy so that we can think about what are those whole school engagement strategies and not just whole school engagement strategies, what are those interventions that we can identify and put in place to support our school leaders and also to support our community partners and really begin to think about resources that are available and those innovative solutions that can be deployed. And when I say innovative solutions, I'm talking about how do we match those solutions and those evidence-based strategies with what we know to be the root causes behind why students are missing school. Next slide, please. So part of the work of the Chronic Absence Task Force has been to think about, going through that national data, talking with some of our stakeholders and partners, and really surfacing some recommendations. And so we're actually in the process of working on those recommendations. And what we're seeing so far is the recommendations that are coming out of the task force really fall into 3 buckets. And those 3 buckets include actionable data, messaging, and implementation. I'm going to provide some examples in each of those buckets. When we think about actionable data, we think about how do we, can we go back? Thank you. When we think about actionable data, we think how do we strengthen our definition to account for students that are highly mobile? Okay, that's one piece of that. So think of that in terms of like that big piece space. When we think about what's happening locally, how do we support and build the capacity of local school leaders on leveraging their own data to notice and identify those trends so that they can say, these are our populations most in need. How do we begin to support them? When we think about messaging, and Cecilia hit on this a little bit, what is the messaging for parents? When do you bring your child to school? But also on top of that, what we're hearing is we really have to begin to elevate the message of why it's important for a child to attend every day, especially as it ties to their academic success. And we need to ensure that that messaging is targeted and tailored to the attended audience. The messaging around the importance of attendance does not look the same in preschool as it does in high school. And we really should scaffold what that messaging looks like. And we all need to be on the same page with that consistent messaging. The third piece is implementation, which I think is important to bring up in terms of selecting those evidence-based strategies. What we're hearing is great. We have the data. We know what populations are experiencing, the highest levels of chronic absence. Where do I start? How do I identify goals? What strategies do I adopt and begin to deploy? And really helping to build the capacity of what does a multi-tiered approach to attendance look like? And so those are some of the pieces that we're working on. And underneath that messaging and implementation bucket, can we go to the next slide, please? I want to share some of the actual tangible work that's coming out of the task force. And part of that is the chronic absence resource guide. Even though chronic absence has been part of A through F accountability since the 2017 school year, we have not had Arizona-specific resources and guidance for the field. And so part of that has been to put together a chronic absence resource guide that the task force has been informing. And it talks about, well, the what of chronic absence, the why of chronic absence. But one of the great things that this resource guide will do is say, what are the different evidence-based interventions that are available at every level? What are those whole school engagement strategies that we can deploy for all students? When I have a student who's sitting like between 10 and 20% chronically absent, what are those layered supports that I can do? And when I have students who are experiencing extreme chronic absence, what's the additional layer of supports that I can offer? And it begins to lay out some of those pieces along with just some supports and resources on how we can select those processes. I think another great piece that we hear is who's doing what in the state of Arizona to address attendance. And the great thing about the chronic absence resource guide is that it calls out those local bright spots. I love the work that's happening in Connecticut, but it feels wonderful to have concrete examples of those directly in your state that you can point to say, oh, this particular school district, on the Navajo Nation has deployed these particular practices. This school district located, in Tucson is deploying these practices, and to have those concrete examples readily available, I think is paramount. I'll shift over to, thank you, you've noticed that I do love to talk, but let me tell you. So I'll go ahead and actually move us to the next slide to talk a little bit more about some professional development and training that's been happening here in the state of Arizona in tandem and in partnership with Attendance Works. And I think this might hit on the question, Member Haley, that you had earlier for Cecilia from Attendance Works. When we were selecting the who was going to be participating in the professional development opportunities, we looked at the data around the state to say, which schools and districts had the highest chronic absence rates. And then we invited them to join us for the professional development that we were offering. And we invited them to join us as teams, not to send a single attendance clerk, but to really think about your team, to think about your school nurse. Who was your administrator? Who was your dropout prevention specialist? Did you have a teacher who would be able to join so that when you're coming together for this training, you're there as a team. So you have the ability to say, what elements can I apply to our own situation? But they're also allowed for the ability to do some cross-pollination because you had other, schools and districts who were joining there as well that you could have conversations with. And so it was a 3-part e-learning series that we did in the fall of 2023 and that we just wrapped up in the fall of 2024. And as a result of that, we were able to train over 350 school district staff across more than 100 public and charter schools here in the state of Arizona. And you don't need to bring it up. That was the last slide.
Lori, and just
Yes.
clarifying that was both, you had an elementary cohort and a high school, middle school, high school cohort, or
We had
combination of?
We had so when you think about it, so for each cohort, there were 2 cohorts within. So we had a pre-K elementary cohort, and then we had a secondary education cohort for high school. And so in the pre-K space, we had several members from, Head Start join us. And then in the high school space, we had a number of high schools from across the state join us as well.
Facing some technical difficulties, we'll open it up for questions on. Oh, okay, perfect. Any questions for Lori on this part or anything so far? Yes, Member Buggles.
I have a couple questions. Thanks, Miss Lori, for that presentation. There were 2. Where is the chronic absence resource guide found? And has it already been given to district leadership?
Oh, great question. So when it is available, which will be
Not available. Got it.
We are doing the final touches on that. It will be available in August. So I think the timing is just right with the start of the new school year. And at that same time, those state level recommendations will be coming out as well.
Excellent. And then the other question that I had is, has there been any research done with year-round schools? And if that affects the chronic absence rates as kids are getting more frequent breaks, and it feels like there's perhaps more wraparound services in those?
Great question. Not to my knowledge, has there been a study that has looked at year-round school versus a traditional school model and how chronic absence impacts that?
We can ask our national consultant attendance works if there is, they might know of
Is
some.
she still on?
She's not, but
Okay.
or I don't think so, but oh, Cecilia.
I
Cecilia,
am
can you
still
hear me?
here and I don't know of any such study. It's a great question. I agree.
Thank you so much for the presentation. 2 questions. I'm curious I was most struck by the data around if a Head Start student or a kindergarten student is chronically absent, then they're 5 times more likely to be chronically absent in 2nd grade, which seems like very clear data in terms of early intervention. I'm curious if there's any data or research on once that intervention is in place for those students, does that impact past 2nd grade? So if we do the work in kindergarten and we intervene, what is the impact of that intervention across the K-8 or K-12 spectrum?
I'll actually defer to Cecilia on that particular question because I'm not sure if there currently is a study that, to my knowledge, that exists that gets to your point on that one.
You all are really coming up with great research questions. We do convene a cohort of researchers who have been working on chronic absence studies. I'm writing all these down, but the answer again is no, not yet.
Okay, great. That'd be great. Thank you. And then I think the second question I have is I think we've spent a lot of our time talking about the incentives around this. We haven't really talked as much about consequences. And so I'm curious if there's also any research on, for example, we've explored the Cuts Light program and, things along those lines where we're talking to families. And I'm curious what the research is on. And obviously, I would much rather lead on the incentive side of this for sure. But I'm curious what the research is or the analysis on. Are there other programs like that, for example, that have either proven to work or that we're considering as other options to support families in making these choices?
So with the Cuts program, you're referring to the Maricopa Cuts program, which is when they become involved with the legal system. To my knowledge, and again, I'll defer to Cecilia, I don't think there is a great body of research that talks about or that demonstrates the effectiveness of taking a punitive measure in which to address chronic absence.
Cecilia, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, I will. I decided I better come back on camera. I'm with you, Lori. So in terms of the research, we have a study out of Minnesota that looked at a progressive consequence model, so to speak, and it showed no effect on improving attendance. Also, there was a study in South Carolina that took a look at their court interventions. And they really saw that the punitive approach not only didn't work, it actually made the students' attendance worse after the intervention. So it was exactly what they didn't want to happen. And as a result, South Carolina as a state has actually changed its approach to a more problem-solving and preventative one, both on the truancy side and on chronic absenteeism. And their courts couldn't be happier because they were flooded with truancy cases. They had over 1 million referrals, which they could not handle. And it's down to a small fraction with much more support. So I would suggest, looking at the results. So clear distinction between court and punitive. You can have a court approach that is actually quite supportive. So we've seen court interventions at tier 3, where the idea is to get the attention of the family, figure out what's going on, and marshal the support of other county or interventions. And I've seen programs like that here in my own home county that had incredible results in terms of getting students with extreme levels of chronic absence, the support they needed, and getting them back to school. So, just being really clear about the terminology as well as the research.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, from my understanding, is actually the intention of the Cuts Light program, is like very much not a punitive approach and very much on the supportive end. And so I would be really curious to understand the impact of that program as well on schools that have engaged with them and on their chronically absent students. And to understand, like, how are we allocating resources right now as a state in terms of like what is being allocated to a more punitive, like if clearly that's not working. And again, I don't think this is an example of a punitive approach, but I'd be really curious to see how those resources are allocated in terms of what's working and what's not.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the committee, I need to ask a favor, a tech-related favor. I don't want to disrupt the flow, so if you have questions, please make sure to write them down so you don't lose them. But if we could take a short break, we have to reset the technology in order to get everything back and working. So maybe a 10-minute break.
Awesome. I think everybody appreciates that and the great questions already. So stay put, Lori, but we get a little break.